What kind of leader has to be explained from the moment of his death, not the moment of his birth? Because when Ali Khamenei died, this was not presented as the end of a normal presidency. It was reported as the fall of the man who had stood at the center of Iran's power for more than 30 decades, a cleric who outlasted presidents, uprisings, sanctions, assassinations, and wars, and who helped shape one of the most consequential rivalries in the modern Middle East. So here is the question that hangs over everything in this story. How did a cleric from Mashhad become the one man Washington and Tel Aviv believed they could not ignore? You have to start with the final image. A strike, a city on edge, state media confirming that Iran's supreme leader was dead, and suddenly, a 36-year era was over. Reuters reported that Khamenei was killed in a U.S.-Israeli strike, while AP described his death as a turning point that could leave a major power vacuum inside the Islamic Republic. But men like Khamenei are never just biographies. They are systems. And when a system is built around one person, his death raises a bigger question than his life ever did. Was Ali Khamenei simply a ruler, or had he become the strategic center of a state, an ideology, and a conflict that stretched far beyond Iran's borders? Reuters' obituary describes his rule as fiercely anti-US and anti-Israel, tied to regional military reach, domestic repression, and the institutions that sustained Iran's power. That is why this story matters to people far beyond Tehran, because to his supporters, he was the guardian of the Islamic Republic. To his critics, he was the architect of repression. And to America and Israel, he was not just a symbol, he was part of the machinery behind Iran's nuclear confrontation, missile posture, and regional network of allies and proxies. And that is what makes his story so dangerous and so important. Because if you want to understand why he was targeted at the end, you first have to understand how he built power in the beginning. And that beginning was far quieter than the ending. It starts in Mashhad in 1939, long before he was feared, hated, admired, or hunted, when he was just the son of a modest cleric growing up in one of Shia Islam's most important cities. And that is where the real story begins. Long before Ali Khamenei became the most powerful man in Iran, he was born into a world of religion, discipline, and scarcity. He was born in Mashhad in 1939, one of the holiest cities in Shia Islam, and he grew up in a modest clerical household, shaped by piety rather than privilege. His father, Sayyid Jawad Khamenei, was a religious scholar, and official biographies describe the family's life as simple and humble. That matters because the man who would later rule Iran for decades did not emerge from military power, royal wealth, or elite Western education. He emerged from the seminary world. And that seminary world did not just teach him theology, it taught him structure, hierarchy, patience, and eventually resistance. As a young student, Khamenei began his religious studies in Mashhad before moving into more advanced scholarship. He later studied in Qom, the city that would become one of the intellectual engines of Iran's clerical establishment. There, he attended the lessons of major Shi'i scholars, including Ruhollah Khomeini, the man who one day would lead the Islamic Revolution. That is the moment this story stops being about education alone. Because in Iran of the 1960s, religion and politics were no longer cleanly separated. The Shah was modernizing the country from above, centralizing power, and confronting clerical opposition. And for a generation of young religious activists, the question was no longer whether politics would enter the mosque. The question was whether the mosque would answer back. Khamenei was among those who answered. By 1963, he was actively involved in opposition to the monarchy. Britannica says he joined protests against the Shah, while his official biography says his lectures and religious classes began attracting revolutionary-minded youth, bringing him under the attention of SAVAK, the Shah's feared security service. and once the state noticed him, the pattern was set.
Surveillance, pressure, detention, release, then arrest again. His official biography says he was arrested multiple times under the Shah, and at one stage was forced underground. One later imprisonment in the mid-1970s was described by his own office as especially severe, and after his release, he was sent back to Mashhad and restricted from lecturing and teaching. That is how revolutionaries are often made, not in one dramatic moment, but in a long sequence of pressure, humiliation, and endurance. By the time Iran moved toward the upheaval of the late 1970s, Khamenei was no longer just a student of religion. He had become a student of power. And in the next part, that education would collide with revolution itself. Ali Khamenei should have been remembered as one more revolutionary official in a turbulent new republic. Instead, history kept pushing him upward. After the 1979 revolution, he moved quickly into the inner structure of the new Islamic Republic. He served on the Revolutionary Council, became Deputy Minister of Defense, and emerged as one of the clerics trusted by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in the fragile years after the Shah's fall. He was no longer just a religious activist. He was now inside the machinery of a revolutionary state. Then came the moment that could have ended everything. In 1981, while speaking at Abu Zar Mosque in Tehran, Khamenei was targeted in a bombing attack. His official biography says he was hospitalized for months afterward, and Reuters notes that the attack left his right arm paralyzed. He survived, but survival changed the story. In revolutionary systems, surviving violence can become its own kind of legitimacy. That matters, because in the Iran of the early 1980s, survival was not symbolic, it was political. Later that year, Khamenei rose to the presidency, a post he would hold from 1981 to 1989. These were not ordinary years in office. Iran was locked in the devastating Iran-Iraq War, a conflict that stretched from 1980 to 1988 and ended in bloody stalemate after immense destruction on both sides. During that period, Reuters says Khamenei became a key figure in the war effort and built close ties to the military, especially the Revolutionary Guards. Relationships that would matter far more later than many outsiders realized at the time. And this is where the rise becomes more interesting, because Khamenei was not the obvious heir to Ayatollah Khomeini. When Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989, Khamenei was already president, but he was still seen by many as a mid-ranking cleric without the stature of the revolution's founder. Reuters reports that he was initially dismissed by influential clerics as weak and an unlikely successor, while Britannica notes that he did not fully meet the traditional qualifications for supreme leadership at the time he was appointed. And yet, he was chosen, not because he looked like the strongest man in the room, but because in revolutionary politics, the person who appears temporary can become permanent. That was the surprise. Ali Khamenei did not inherit power as a giant. He inherited it as an underestimated man in a system full of stronger personalities, deeper credentials, and bigger reputations. Reuters describes him as an unlikely choice who went from a weak president to an initially weak supreme leader before tightening his grip over the country's power structure. And that is why Part 4 matters so much, because the real story is not how he reached the top. The real story is how a man once seen as weak turned power into a system built to outlast everyone around him. Ali Khamenei's real power was not charisma, it was architecture. By the time he had settled into supreme leadership, he was no longer simply ruling Iran through speeches or symbolism. He was ruling through institutions, loyalists in the military, influence over the judiciary, pressure on elected governments, and a system designed to make sure that even when presidents changed, the center of power did not. Reuters says Khamenei suppressed repeated unrest at home, quashed the ambitions of more independent-minded presidents, and installed loyalists across the military and judiciary. That is what made him different. Some leaders dominate the moment. Khamenei worked to dominate the structure behind the moment. And at the heart of that structure was the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. The IRGC had been created after the 1979 revolution, and its size and stature grew dramatically during the Iran-Iraq War. Under Khamenei, that relationship deepened into something more powerful. The Guard was not just a military force inside the state, it became one of the pillars of the state itself. AP says Iran under Khamenei became a theocratic system dominated by the Revolutionary Guard, while Britannica notes that the IRGC's role expanded significantly after its creation in 1979. That matters because once a leader is backed not just by ideology but by an entrenched security structure, removing pressure from the top does not automatically weaken the system below it. And Khamenei understood that. He understood that lasting power does not come from being loved, it comes from being embedded. That same logic shaped the nuclear issue. For years, Iran's nuclear program sat at the center of its confrontation with the West. Reuters reports that Khamenei long denied Iran was seeking a nuclear weapon, cautiously supported the 2015 nuclear deal, and then hardened further after the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018. A separate Reuters explainer notes that the 2015 deal curbed parts of Iran's program before the U.S. exit reopened the crisis. So the nuclear file was never just about centrifuges, it was about sovereignty, deterrence, leverage, and the question of whether Iran could be pressured into changing course or whether pressure would only make the system more defiant. But Khamenei's power was not only tested abroad, it was tested at home again and again. Reuters says Iran saw major student-led protests in 1999 and 2002, a deeper legitimacy crisis after the disputed 2009 election, and another major challenge in 2022 after the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody. In that 2022 moment, Reuters reported that Khamenei backed the police, blamed foreign enemies for the unrest, and signaled a tougher crackdown as protests spread to universities. This is the part of the story that defines his rule most sharply. To supporters, he was defending the Islamic Republic from chaos, foreign pressure, and internal fracture. To critics, he was proving that the system could tolerate hardship, but not dissent. Reuters' obituary describes his rule as one that used an iron fist against unrest at home, while AP says his tenure was marked by internal repression and repeated protest crackdowns. And then there was the region. Khamenei did not confine Iranian power to Iran's borders. Reuters says he expanded Iranian influence by empowering allied forces and militias across Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, building what became known as the Axis of Resistance. Billions were spent over decades to project influence, deter enemies, and challenge U.S. and Israeli power far from Tehran. That is why this chapter is so important, because by this point, Ali Khamenei was no longer just a supreme leader in the constitutional sense. He had become the strategic center of a network, domestic, military, ideological, and regional. And once a man becomes the center of a system like that, his enemies stop asking whether they can pressure him. They start asking whether they can leave him in place. And that brings us to the final question. Why did America and Israel come to see Ali Khamenei not just as a rival, but as a problem they believed could only be solved at the top? So now we come back to the question from the beginning. How did a cleric from Mashhad become the one man Washington and Tel Aviv believed they could not ignore? The answer is this: because Ali Khamenei was no longer just a leader, he had become the strategic center of a system. By the final years of his rule, Khamenei stood at the top of an Iranian power structure that touched almost every major point of confrontation with the United States and Israel: the nuclear dispute, missile development, the Revolutionary Guard, regional proxy networks, and the ideological refusal to accept a U.S.-led order in the Middle East. Reuters says his rule was defined by hostility toward the U.S. and Israel, by support for Iran-backed armed groups across the region, and by a long-running confrontation over Iran's nuclear trajectory. That is why the final chapter of his life cannot be explained as the death of an ordinary head of state. To his enemies, he was not simply a symbol sitting above the system, he was the point where the system connected. Publicly, Washington framed the strikes around security. Reuters reports that U.S. officials said the goal was to end what they described as a decades-long threat from Iran and make sure it could not develop a nuclear weapon. Reuters also notes that one of the publicly stated concerns behind earlier attacks was that Iran was getting too close to being able to produce a nuclear weapon, even as Tehran denied seeking one, and outside assessments had long been more nuanced on the issue. Israel's logic was even more direct. For years, Israeli leaders had treated Iran's military reach, missile capability, and support for anti-Israel armed groups as a strategic threat. Reuters reports that during the latest operation, Israeli and U.S. forces targeted Iran while Khamenei was meeting senior advisors, indicating that this was not just an attack on infrastructure, but an attack on the top of the command structure itself. And that is the key to the entire story. If Part 4 was about how Khamenei turned power into a system, then Part 5 is about what happens when his enemies conclude that pressuring the system is not enough. They try to hit the center. Because in their view, Khamenei was tied to too many things at once: the doctrine, the chain of command, the regional posture, the nuclear defiance, and the idea that Iran could absorb pressure without changing course. Reuters' obituary makes that reading hard to avoid. It describes him as the man who tightened control over Iran's military and judiciary, expanded Iran's regional influence, backed the axis of resistance, and outlasted repeated internal and external shocks. But this is where the story becomes bigger than one man. Because removing a leader is not the same thing as removing the system he spent decades building. Reuters reported before the strike that analysts and Iranian officials feared outside military pressure could destabilize the leadership and even reignite domestic unrest, while another Reuters report said CIA assessments had warned Khamenei's death could shift power toward harder-line Revolutionary Guard elements. So in the end, the answer to the opening question is not just that America and Israel saw Ali Khamenei as dangerous, it is that they appeared to see him as central to Iran's posture, central to its deterrence model, central to the network of power that had defined Iran's place in the region for decades. Reuters and AP both describe him as the country's ultimate authority since 1989, sitting above elected institutions and shaping Iran's military, political, and ideological direction. And that is why his story ends where it began, not with a biography, but with a question about power. Because Ali Khamenei was targeted not only because of whom he was, but because of what he represented: a state, a strategy, and a confrontation his enemies believed could not be contained forever. That is the strategic reading supported by Reuters' reporting on the strike, timing, the stated U.S. rationale, and Khamenei's central role in Iran's system. It remains an interpretation, but it is the interpretation that best fits the record now in public view. But the last question may be even more important than the first. Did killing the man end the threat they feared? Or did it open a far more dangerous chapter after him? Reuters says the aftermath of his death was immediately uncertain, with concerns about retaliation, regional escalation, and a possible power shift inside Iran.